Our next speaker is going to be going over CMMC 2.0 assessment process. So, introducing Matt Hoeper, he is a cybersecurity solution area lead, senior consultant, and instructor at Edwards Performance Solution, a C3 PA organization. Matt is also active in the cybersecurity community as a Forbes SMB advisory board member and a member of FBI's InfraGard. Welcoming Matt.
Thank you, Kate. It's good to be with you. So I am going to kind of give an overview of what the process would look like for an OSC, an organization seeking certification. So the very first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to identify what level you need to be at. As Payam mentioned before, if you're in possession of only FCI, that would put you at level 1, which is self-attestation. And if you're in possession of CUI, that puts you at least level 2, where you would need a C3PAO, which is a CMMC third-party assessment organization, come out and assess you. So you're going to want to identify what level you need to be at. That question always comes up. Am I in possession of CUI? And I would always push back on a contract officer, figure out what the contract states. And if you have any questions regarding that, certainly reach out to your CO. So once you've identified the level, you're going to want to engage with a CMMC professional. Now, even at level 1, which is self-attestation, I would still recommend that you engage with a CMMC professional. You can go to the marketplace and find RPOs and RPs on there. But I would recommend that you do that even at level 1, because it's always nice to get another set of eyes on things. If you're at level 2, certainly want to engage with a CMMC professional, because there's a lot to do there from a CMMC perspective. So once you've then have engaged with a CMMC professional, you're going to want to identify the scope. And Michael talked about scope. Now, my recommendation when it comes to scope is to narrow the scope as much as you can. Some organizations use enclaves, which is a cloud service, say a Microsoft, for instance. But you're going to want to narrow the scope as much as you can, because the larger the scope, the more costly it will likely be for you. You're assessing more, you're having to put controls on more systems, and the likelihood that you would pass diminishes a little bit. I'm not saying that you won't pass. What I'm saying is that the bigger the scope is, the more likely that you would have an unfavorable result. So I always like to narrow the scope as much as I can. And a CMMC professional will be able to help you with that. So you've identified the scope. Then what you want to do is you want to conduct a gap assessment or a gap analysis against the scope, the systems within the scope. So what you're doing is you're assessing all the practices that apply to that scope and doing a gap analysis to figure out where your shortfalls are. Now, those shortfalls that you come up with, the POAMs, plan of action and milestones, basically it's a to-do list. You're writing down all the things that you need to do as an organization to fix things, to make sure that you can go into assessment with what you believe is a perfect score. Because here's the thing. Some organizations want to say, well, I'll go ahead and call the C3PAO to come in and assess me, but I have some POAM items, some things I need to fix that are related to the 110 controls. And I never suggest doing that. Always go into the assessment thinking that you are perfect, because the assessor will probably find something that is wrong, that you might need to fix, or that could stop the assessment entirely and result in a fail. And I'll talk a little bit about what that process looks like from an assessment perspective. So once you've identified your level, you've engaged with a CMMC professional, you've identified the scope, you've conducted a gap assessment, you've completed all the projects, then you're ready to perform an assessment. And if you're doing a self-assessment, then you go ahead and assess yourself. Hopefully the information that you got from the CMMC professional that you engaged with will help you with that. But then if you're at level 2 or above, you would need to engage someone else to come in and do the assessment. They will perform the assessment, and through the process, there's 4 phases of the process. The first phase, when you've engaged with a C3PAO, is you'll plan and prepare the assessment. That's a lot of planning that goes in. You'll identify a C3PAO that you might want to work with. You'll reach out to them. I believe they have 5 business days to respond to you. But what you're doing in the planning and preparation of an assessment is you're establishing the roles and the responsibilities. Who from the OSC is going to represent the organization to the assessor. Now, if you're working with an MSP, you could have someone from the MSP help represent you, but I would always recommend that when you are going through the practices, make sure that someone from the OSC or the MSP that's representing you have real knowledge of how that practice is implemented. So you're going to want to talk to the subject matter experts. You're going to want to talk to the people who administer the system, those people that have the ability to answer those questions. So you'll establish those roles and responsibilities in the planning and preparation of the assessment. You'll hand off probably some documentation, the SSP for sure. The lead assessor at the C3PAO is going to want to take a look at your SSP. They're going to come up with schedules and timelines, and there's a lot that then goes into that planning and preparation stage. The second phase would be the actual conducting of the assessment. And the assessor is going to be looking at a couple of things. We assess at what we call the objective level, and that's already been mentioned. But it's very important to know that, because if you're an OSC and you haven't engaged with a professional, a CMMC professional, and you're trying to do it yourself, make sure you're doing it at the objective level. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, anybody on this call or listening to the webinar has kids, or knows someone who has kids, or has been a kid yourself. If I ask a kid, is your room clean? Say the control statement says the room has to be clean. And how do I measure that? Because if you ask the child, is your room clean? The child's going to say, yes, it's clean. Well, how do you measure that? The bed is made, the clothes are put away, the toys are put away, the trash is picked up. Okay. So if I'm assessing the practice, the room has to be clean, I am looking to make determinations on those four things: bed made, clothes picked up, toys put away, trash thrown away. If the bed is made and the toys are put away and the trash is thrown away, but the clothes aren't put away, the room isn't clean. So you don't get partial credit for the practice. It's either all or nothing. So if you miss even one objective, you fail that practice. And so that's very important. Now, if I'm an assessor and I'm assessing that, there's three methods I could use to make a determination of whether or not a practice is met. I can examine evidence, things like policies, procedures, records, that kind of stuff. I can interview someone, which means I'm talking to someone about how something is implemented, or I could test. And when we talk about test, I, as an assessor, am not hands-on keys. I'm not running scanning tools. I'm not running the test. I'm observing you running the test, which is why it's really important to make sure that you have someone who's a subject matter expert or an administrator of the system present to do that. So an example of test might be, if your policy states that your password locks out after 5 unsuccessful attempts, I may ask you, hey, type in your password 5 times just to see if it does actually what it's supposed to. Now, I only have to use one of those, interview, examine, or test, but I can use more if I want to, because it goes to what we call adequacy and sufficiency, which is, does it answer the question, and does it provide enough evidence for me as an assessor to ensure that you're actually meeting that particular practice. So an example of that might be, you showed me a screenshot of some setting. I may want to see that setting live. So I've examined the screenshot that you have provided to me, but I've also said, hey, can you go ahead and show me that in the system? So then you would log in, I observe you logging in and showing me that particular setting live. So that's what we're doing when we're conducting the assessment. Now, when we score a practice, scoring a practice means met, not met, or not applicable. Not applicable, you probably will need someone from the DoD CIO to writing. You can actually email them and say, hey, does this meet it? I have this particular configuration. I believe that this is not applicable. Is this not applicable? What you don't want to do is you want to make sure that you're not just saying it's not applicable because, for instance, you're not using wireless. So a practice that talks about wireless connectivity and making sure that that confidentiality of the connection is there. Instead of saying not applicable, what you would say is, in policy, we do not have wireless as a matter of policy, and then I may scan for rogue wireless access points once a month. I would consider that met, even though you don't have wireless. You've addressed it and you've met it because you're doing things from a technical perspective to ensure that you're meeting that practice. So we conduct the assessment. The next thing, phase 3, would be reporting the recommended assessment results. So hopefully you've gone through the assessment, you've met all 110 practices, you're perfect, you're good. We upload the score, we upload the documentation, you get a certification, and you're good for 3 years. Now, should you not meet all the practices, every one of the practices has a numerical value associated with it. Some of the more the practices that might have more of an impact to the security of the organization would be 5 points. The ones that maybe not have quite as much of an impact would be 3 points, and then the ones that would have a lower impact would be 1 point. If I'm going through the assessment and I see that a 3 point or a 5 point scored practice is not met, it's an automatic failure. You do not get the opportunity to fix during the assessment or the 180 days in the closeout poems and assessment phase, which I'll talk about in a minute. You can only get a conditional certification for 1 pointers, and you have to be at least an 88 out of 110. So if I'm doing the assessment and I find that you have met, haven't met 5 pointers, that would take you down to 105. In the CAP, the CMMC assessment process, there's a section that talks about limited practice deficiency, and those practices are all 1 pointers, but those are the ones that are only allowed to be poemed and worked on for the 180 days. So phase 4 is the closeout poems and assessment. Should you have not passed with 110 and you get to a place where you've missed 8, 10, 12 1 pointers, as long as you're an 88, you can get 180 days to fix those poemed items related to those 1 point practices, and then have either the C3PAO that you were working with come back out and assess you, or just those practices, or you can have another C3PAO come out and assess you, just those practices. When you get to the point of an 88 out of 100, you can win a contract with a conditional certification, but you have 180 days to fix those. And so we assume then that if you win that contract with that conditional certification, that you will work to close out those poems in the 180 days. It's very, very important. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the considerations with external service providers. Now, I make a delineation between a managed service provider and a cloud service provider. Either way, the cloud service provider or the managed service provider is going to be involved in the assessment for the practices that they're meeting. So I can't stress enough, if you are working with a managed service provider, make sure that you know exactly what that managed service provider is providing you, because we don't want a situation where you're going through the assessment and as an OSC, you're trying to answer a particular objective of a practice, and you point to the MSP and say, they're doing it. And the MSP looks at you and says, no, you're supposed to be doing that. So make sure that you have what we call a shared responsibility matrix, which clearly spells out what the MSP is providing you and what you are doing as an OSC. That's very, very important. We don't want anything slipping through the cracks, because again, if you miss one objective, you fail that particular practice. Now, going forward, if you are at a level 2 and you have a C3PAO come out to your organization to assess you, that assessment is good for 3 years. But on the off years, you have to do a self-assessment. So say year 1, you have your C3PAO come out, they assess you. That assessment, that certification is good for 3 years. Year 2, you do a self-assessment. Year 3, you do a self-assessment. Then year 4, which is 3 years removed from year one, you would have the C3PAO come out and do an assessment again for certification that's good for 3 years. Then year 5, you do a self-assessment, year 6. So you guys see the pattern here. If you have any questions, throw them in the chat and we'll have time at the end to answer those. But that's all I have from a C3PAO perspective. Back to you, Kate.